Well, good day, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. On behalf of the Asia Society Policy Institute, we're so pleased to invite you today to what I think is going to be a really interesting program about the U.S.-China trade talks. We have two veteran Wall Street Journal reporters, Bob Davis and Lingling Wei, and we're also joined by Clete Willems, who is part of President Trump's negotiating team. Before I get into the program for today, I just wanted to highlight an upcoming program we'll be holding later this month, and that's with Aditya Mattu, who's the World Bank Chief Economist for East Asia. I'll be interviewing him on the recent World Bank economic growth forecast and also the role of the World Bank in the whole COVID crisis and economic recovery. Well, today we're going to be discussing the new book just out. I'm going to put it up here, Superpower Showdown, again, co-authored by Bob Davis and Lingling Wei. It chronicles the Trump administration's trade war with China, which culminated last February in the Phase 1 U.S.-China trade agreement. These negotiations, in many ways, I think, if not the most closely watched trade negotiation ever, clearly one of the most significant trade negotiations, and people from all over the world were watching these talks. It was characterized by lots of ups and downs, lots of tariffs, cabinet officials being sidelined, and it involved extensive demands and important concessions. It resulted in Americans becoming conversant on topics like tariffs, trade deficits, and unfair trade practices. And when the Phase 1 deal was concluded in December, you could just hear a sigh of relief, not only in the United States, but around the world, that there would be at least a pause in the tensions between the United States and China. Well, today we're going to learn more about these talks, both from the DC and the Beijing perspectives. Bob Davis is joining us, senior editor at the Wall Street Journal, winner of the Pulitzer Prize and the Overseas Press Club Award. He was posted in Beijing between 2011 and 2014. And importantly, he also covered China's WTO accession in 2001 and leading up to that. Lingling Wei, also from the Wall Street Journal, and until recently, she was working at the journal's Beijing bureau. She's covered the intersection of Chinese politics and economics for the journal for many years. And through the years, she's been in Beijing. She was in Beijing starting in 2011. And we'll get to that because over her 10 years there, she developed some incredible contacts and sources, which I think probably helped her in her reporting and writing this book. The book has received amazing reviews. Publishers Weekly has called it required reading for anyone concerned about America's future. I personally read it cover to cover. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It provides incredible insights into what Washington was thinking, what Beijing was thinking, and how really both sides throughout this process, I think, misread each other. The way we're going to proceed is I'm going to ask some questions, starting with Bob and Lingling, and then we'll have Clete come in, and then we'll open the floor through to questions from the audience. If you're on YouTube, you can just send them in, and we'll get them. So I'll start with Bob first with my first question. And that has to do with a quote that comes early in the book. And you call the U.S.-China relations a romance gone bad. And frankly, I personally think that might have been a better title for the book, but that's my personal opinion. So I guess my question for you is, when did this romance occur? When did it start to unravel? Like, was there one incident, or was this kind of building up over time? Over to you, Bob.
Well, thanks, Wendy, and thanks to the Asia Society. We're really, really pleased to be invited as part of this event. So, yeah, I mean, we have to go back in time here. Let's go back into the late 1990s. China's looking to get into the WTO. The U.S. wants them in the WTO. The Soviet Union has collapsed. it looks like democracy was breaking out all over the world. Latin America was turning democratic. South Korea, Taiwan had all shucked off dictatorships. And the view was in Washington that economic engagement and tying the countries together through economic and trade bonds would eventually lead to political liberalization in China. So there's the political part, and then it works seamlessly with the commercial end. So people who were investing in China, thinking it was an enormous market, which obviously it is, also could feel good about themselves that what they were doing, one thought would lead to political liberalization. From the Chinese side, the U.S. was the model to emulate, at least economically, even not just for ordinary Chinese, but for the elites as well. Again, not politically, but on economic terms. And then it wasn't any one particular event that led to the souring of relations. I think an important event was the global financial crisis. So we're now up at 2008, 2009, a crisis created in the United States and spread around the world. So at that point, the U.S. was trying to recruit China's for help. President Bush called up Hu Jintao, who was then the Chinese leader, invited him to Washington to be part of the first group of 20 leaders meeting ever to deal with the crisis. He immediately accepted, pressed him to stimulate the economy, which clearly was in China's interest as well, accepted again. So in some ways, it's the high point of the relationship, but it also led, I think, to deterioration. Part of the part of the stimulus, rather, was an enormous increase in commodity production in China. Those commodities like furniture, steel, glass, wound up coming into the U.S., decimating a lot of factory towns. The Chinese elites no longer looked at the U.S. as a model to emulate, given that, as I say, the U.S. economy, the U.S. financial practices are almost taking down the global economy. And for the business community, China acting more independently meant more pressure on their technology, more pressure on them to act in the way that China wanted them to, and also a growing realization that it wasn't the golden opportunity that many of the companies thought it was. So from that, the last 10 years rather, you've seen a decline, and then with the Trump administration, clearly, it all coalesced into a more bitter relationship.
Lingling, question for you. Do you think China thought that they could rekindle this romance, particularly when Trump first came into office? I'm thinking of the Mar-a-Lago visit and then, the state visit by Trump to China, where it seemed that he was treated like a king.
Exactly. Well, initially, first of all, thank you very much to Wendy and the Asia Society. Couldn't be happier to be here. So definitely, initially after President Trump won the election, the Chinese side basically spared no effort to do this charm offensive. In a sense, trying to win him over. The Mar-a-Lago visit by Xi Jinping, and also the what China call the state plus visit. It's the kind of treatment the Chinese, never made to any other foreign leader. And the timing was also very interesting. It took place right after the very important Party Congress, which further strengthened Xi Jinping's rule of the country. So, as we detailed in the book, it was President Xi Jinping personally and his wife gave President Trump and his wife a tour of the Forbidden City. Had tea there. Never the kind of splendor. Really, even for Chinese watching TV back then, it was like, wow, that was some treatment to a guest. But even then, the tensions, the Chinese side started to really have a sense that, yes, Trump probably was transactional in a way, but many in his cabinet are very hawkish about China. And that's not something they can just, win over with one state visit. During the, couple anecdotes we had in the book. So during the visit, there were two meetings the American side had with senior Chinese leaders. One was with President Xi Jinping himself. The other one was with Premier Li Keqiang. So back then, the Chinese had always thought on trade issues was Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, who was the lead guy on trade talks. And then Secretary Ross actually didn't even get into the meeting. He was sitting outside the conference room and the people's, the great hall of the people, waiting to be consulted. And the officials on the Chinese side were mystified by that. They had no idea what happened and why they were not informed about the change, such a major change. And during those meetings, it was the U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, spoke really harshly, very blunt way, what China did wrong over the years, the IP theft and all that. So that already started to emerge even during that state visit. Plus, it's not that easy to win them over. I remember one of my sources told me, looks like we can't bluff our way out this time. So it was pretty it was we had all that in the book. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. I wanted now to kind of pivot to really, in my mind, a real critical time in the negotiation, and that is last spring. I had to look up this morning. It was only 1 year ago. It seems like it was 5 years ago. But last spring, about 14 months ago in April, it really looked like this negotiation was headed towards a successful conclusion. And, people like you and others were reporting that the two sides were trying to pick a location on where some kind of signing ceremony could take place. But then we saw that unravel, and there was the back and forth with a negotiation. According to your book, I think you mentioned that Ambassador Lighthizer, he sensed that Li He had some problems with the text, and he invited Li He to, send him a text with his problems, not expecting that a significant portion of the text would be crossed out. And that led quickly to the United States holding a press conference announcing that China had reneged on the deal, and then leading the president to start the process for another tranche of tariffs. So I'd be interested from your perspective, what happened then? Was this a case of both sides just misreading the other side? That each side thought they had more leverage, each side thought that the other side needed the deal too badly, and so they could ask for more or take away more? Or were there other factors at play?
Why don't I start from the American perspective? So, as you say, and as we detail in the book, yes, the U.S. side thought they were very close to a deal on a pretty sweeping agreement that would have dealt with a lot of the intellectual property issues that have bedeviled the relationship, but also significantly would have committed China to change very specific laws and regulations by certain dates. As one count, somebody told me there were as many as 60 different changes that the Americans thought the Chinese had agreed to. And I think, Lighthizer and Treasury Secretary Mnuchin were dealing with their intermediary Liu He, who I think that they felt had significant or had sufficient authority to sign off on the deal. And as you say, they were looking at different locations. Liu He never, as far as we know, never said it was a definite deal. And the American side didn't portray it that way. But unknown to the American side, there was a lot of rethinking going on in Beijing, and Lingling can talk about that.
Lingling.
Sure. So the mood in Beijing was much gloomier than any of us sensed at the time. Probably because Bob and I were very close to getting our book leave, and we were also personally had an interest in seeing a deal. So we were just blindly optimistic about this as well. But anyway, so all joking aside, so, something entirely different happened in China. Let me just take a little step back and explain a little how the Chinese system works. So obviously it is very different from the US system, and it's steeped in secrecy, very little visibility into what the top leadership is doing. So as time went by and we were able to get a little bit more detail about exactly what transpired in April of last year that caused the talks to collapse. So one thing was, yes, President Xi Jinping has established himself as the most powerful and assertive leader in recent Chinese history, but even he still, doesn't have absolute power. If you look back at Chairman Mao and Deng Xiaoping, they didn't have absolute power either. Always for years, for decades, the Chinese top leaders always try to seek consensus, among their colleagues, before they take significant or drastic actions to do something. And the U.S.-China trade deal would fall into that category. There's nothing else more important, few other things more important to China's leadership these days than this U.S.-China relationship. So of course, Xi Jinping can't just go it along and sign off on the deal without consulting with the other members of the Standing Committee and the Politburo. So we found out that there was a very big Standing Committee meeting that took place before the American negotiators came to Beijing for another round of negotiations in early May. So during that meeting, the support for the deal was tepid at most. 3 members of the committee actually voted yes, and 3 voted no. It all came down to President Xi Jinping himself. So hardly a consensus at the time, very split. And at the time, the top leader himself also kind of got cold feet. He just came back from touring Europe. Everybody was murmuring into his ears that, we hope that whatever deal you cut with the Americans wouldn't divert purchases from our countries. And the Belt and Road Forum at the time was a huge success for President Xi. Also, despite the U.S. boycott, a lot of other countries joined. And also, very importantly, the Chinese economy had stabilized by that time. That was a very important factor. So the Chinese side felt like time was on their side. And what, for them, it was, and then the top leader just told his negotiator, Vice Premier Liu He, push harder. We can't accept the draft as it is written, and tell the Americans that, of course, we're going to do some reforms, change some regulations, laws to better protect IP, but we cannot be seen as caving to the U.S. pressure. So that's what happened. Then Vice Premier Liu He, during the meetings with Representative Lighthizer and Munition, he just said, I didn't have the mandate to cut a deal. The draft of the agreement couldn't have been accepted as written. The message back from the American side was, okay, pick a chapter and mark up, but make as little changes as you can. I think it was, I can't remember the date, but it's in the book. Sometime either very late April or early May, it was a Friday, the Chinese side sent back the revised version and basically crossed out a third of that IP chapter that just didn't sit well with the American side. So that's what really transpired in Beijing. There are two telling signs that in hindsight I felt like I should have paid more attention to. One of the telling signs was sometime in April, Vice Premier Hu Chunhua, who's in charge, a Politburo member and also in charge of trade, in charge of foreign investment and trade too. So he told a Japanese delegation that he was not sure at all that the US-China could cut a deal anytime soon. Now, that comment actually happened before all the optimistic remarks made by senior officials in Washington. And what he said was the Americans just making one demand after another, they don't feel like they can accept that. So that was one telling sign. And the other telling sign that came a little bit late was already after the standing committee meeting and all that was also very early in May. There's a very influential and also official social media account. It's called Taoran Note. Taoran Note is run by the Economics Daily. It's a state-owned newspaper, directly reports to state council. So absolutely what was written in that article reflected what the top leadership was thinking at the time. The little blog post just reads like, if one party only considers its demands and thinks it can use extreme pressure to force the other party to submit and ignore fairness, then there's not any other possibility than breaking up. So those, in hindsight, those were really two telling signs that I wish I had paid more attention to while I was reporting on the trade war. So anyway, that's my take.
Well, it's fascinating because I think the part in the book when you really go into the different views of the standing committee and the discussion that was being held among Xi and his senior party colleagues was incredible, and just incredible reporting. There was also one great quote you guys had in the book, and this is something that I think just captures a lot of trade negotiations I've been in, and that's something along the lines of, just because Lihe didn't say no, that didn't mean Beijing said yes. And I know I've been in the room lots of times with lots of different USTRs, and if the other side doesn't push back, it's so you almost you get euphoric about, great, then they accept that part, they accept it, it's okay. But as a seasoned negotiator, I'd always warn people, just because they're not saying anything doesn't mean that they've endorsed it. And I think it seems like that kind of happened here. Just another question on that text. When it was sent back, everyone focused on the fact there were all these legislative changes that were asked by the US side, and they were crossed out. But I've also heard there were substantive provisions crossed out, and that frankly, if maybe there had been a willingness on the US side at that time to negotiate on those legislative issues, that May text actually may have been stronger than the phase one deal we have now. Any comment on that?
I wish I could say that we, had actually seen the little text, but we hadn't. So I don't really know. There were a few things, I'm not sure if that was in the text, but for instance, the Treasury Secretary had talked about China agreeing to provisions regarding currency manipulation and so on, or currency policy. That really, again, they never really did agree to that. The US thought they did, and they sort of came up with something at the end. So I'm not sure that was stronger in May than what they wound up with. But I think from the China, Lingling will know this better than me, but I think from the Chinese point of view, it was like, they're sending back the text with lots of crossouts was just another step in the negotiations, right? And we should go on from there. There've been plenty of other times where things were stalled, but that's not the way it was read in Washington. It was read as bad faith.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
That's for sure. Really strong language on the U.S. side, and then followed by tariff actions. Could we move then quickly to your thoughts on when and why the president agreed to pivot to a partial deal, a phased deal? There's a quote in the book, I loved it, where you said Trump wanted a grand slam, not a single. And I just recall reading a lot of the criticism from the administration of previous administrations saying that they took incremental approaches, that they should have just gone for all of it. So I'm sure this wasn't an easy decision, but it was taken. And any insights into that? And I think for Lingling, I would ask, I mean, I'm sure that's what China wanted all along, was to do as little as possible. So this served their interest. Was this viewed as a big concession by the United States?
Well, so from the U.S. side, I think, we're now getting into September-ish timeframe. Right before that, I think was the sort of the harshest moment of the U.S.-China negotiations, where the president had tweeted that American companies should be ready to bring their companies home. He had another round of tariffs. The markets were reacting negatively to that, and the election's coming up. And I think his negotiator, who is a person, Lighthizer that is a person who is ideologically opposed to Beijing, but is a negotiator. I mean, he's a lawyer, he's a trade lawyer. And I think he saw that it was time to try to get the best deal they possibly could. And, he, at that point, is the way I look at it, kind of, instead of being on the side that was in opposition to the NEC director, Cutler at the point, or the Secretary of Treasury, Mnuchin, all three of them, decided decided that it was time to kind of break this into phases. And they wound up liking the idea of phase one, phase two, phase three so much that they would joke, whenever there was some other difficult problem, well, let's do a phase one version of this. And then the president went along on it. The president, after all, was mostly focused on purchases, and the phase one deal, whether you believe they'll carry it out or not, is mainly about purchases. So I would give a lot of two things. One, markets were reacting to the elections coming up.
And just how about the issue of fatigue? Just tired of this negotiation.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that's part of it too.
Yeah. Lingling, did China view the United States' willingness to go for a partial deal as a major concession or a victory?
Not really. Well, China, even though it was a partial deal, right? It seemed like that's what China had always wanted. But even for that little partial phase one deal, there were a lot of people in China who thought the Chinese side had given up too much, because after all, the purchase target looked really ginormous, right? And the tariff relief was relatively small. So even within China, people thought, we're probably caved too much. So I remember right after I came back from, I covered that signing of phase one with Bob in Washington in January. So soon after I came back, I was looking through the state media coverage of the phase one deal. Obviously, their coverage reflected the leadership's concern that, people would think they gave up too much. So coverage just, played up the whole mutually beneficial, all those terms. But again, this Taoran note, this social media account chimed in with a more realistic assessment of the deal, acknowledged that in both countries there were people who were not happy with this deal. In America, many people thought it didn't go far enough. In China, went too far. So ultimately, as Bob and I did, is a story for the Wall Street Journal, page one story. Ultimately, it was a deal both sides, not entirely happy about. So in China, yeah, but still, they were overall, there was a sigh of relief, as Wendy, you said earlier, that at least, sort of like we're entering a pause of what had been just endless escalation of trade tension.
And just a follow-up question for you on that. I remember China putting down 3 red lines for what the final agreement had to look like. They called for balance, they called for realistic purchasing requirements. Both of those seem you could fudge them, but they also said they wanted all the tariffs lifted. That sure didn't happen in the phase 1 deal.
Absolutely. That was a concession on China's part because, as we mentioned in the book, what they agreed to under phase 1 also was relatively limited. Purchasing was a big part. And, the IP, there's some about IP, some market access. So basically what happened was China gave a little bit something to each of the 3 main decision makers on the US side. For President Trump, it was purchases. For Lighthizer, it was IP and enforcement. And for Secretary Mnuchin, it was financial market access. So, China, it felt like, it did try to give as little as possible, as you mentioned earlier, but, ended up did give a lot, by China's standards, but they didn't have as much tariff reduction as they had hoped for. So it was definitely concession on China's part. I guess another factor that in hindsight, that we, that might into play was the whole issue with Hong Kong. At the time, China had been working on this national security law thing on Hong Kong, for months, and they probably, wanted to at least settle one thing with the United States, and they can shift their focus to something else.
Bob, you mentioned the U.S. business community early on, and they were strong advocates, obviously, for China's accession to the WTO, and were strong advocates for the relationship for many years, but over time they did turn sour. But in the book, you talk about the business community really kind of being ineffective, the administration not really interested in listening to their views, and that the role many in the business community ended up playing were basically intermediaries versus kind of providing policy input. Can you comment on that?
Sure. So this is an administration that works hand in glove with business. On tax policy, first of all, they're appoint lobbyists to be cabinet officials. On tax policy, business has an enormous has an enormous role on deregulation, without a doubt. But on this particular issue, on trade, this is an issue that the president feels most comfortable with. Tariffs, he obviously believes tariffs are the tactic that you use time and time again. And so the business community did have input in terms of what the U.S. was asking for. The business community provided lots and lots of information on the practices that they found offensive in China. And that was, without a doubt, rolled into what the U.S. asked for of China. So there's that. That was in the beginning of it. But, the business community almost uniformly opposed the tactics that the administration used. They were 100% with China on the idea that tariffs were self-defeating and, were hurting the U.S. as much or more than it was hurting China. And on that, they had zero influence, just like zero influence. I mean, there were some people like Steve Schwarzman of Blackstone who would talk regularly to the president, and he could bring up things about how the markets were reacting. And that certainly, markets, without a doubt, certainly had an impact on the president. But, in prior negotiations, like the China WTO negotiations, I mean, business just had an enormous influence on what the U.S. was asking for and the kind of tactics that the U.S. took. In this case, not so much, not hardly at all. Even as you can see, as we were just talking about in the final deal, there was almost no tariff relief, and that's, was not just China's goal, it was also the goal of U.S. industry. So yeah, and they did play intermediary roles, certainly. People like Schwartzman or Hank Paulson, who didn't have a relationship with the president, but did with Mnuchin, some of the other, Sheldon Adelson, people the president is comfortable with and respects, definitely had a role as just taking messages back and forth, but sort of a messenger boy kind of role.
Okay, Clete looks like he's been just dying to talk for a while. So I'm going to turn it over to Clete. Again, Clete was in the room for most of these negotiations. And I, inviting Clete, I made sure that he would read the book cover to cover, which he told me that he has done. And so for Clete, what I want to ask you, based on what was said today, but also based on the book, what did Bob and Lingling get right? What did they get wrong? What did they miss?
Yeah, well, so I want to start by just congratulating Bob and Lingling on what they've produced here. I really do think it is a great piece of work. And I was joking with them earlier. I think they must have some pretty decent sources on some of this stuff, because it really is a very accurate rendition of a lot of what happened. So I think that is, one of the things I would say at the outset. The other thing I really like, and I think you were talking about this earlier with some of Lingling's reporting around April and May and what happened there. And my perception of it is that there was a misunderstanding on both sides in terms of where we were in the negotiations. On the U.S. side, we clearly thought we were at the end game, and that this was going to be basically one of the last meetings we had before we signed text. And I think China didn't necessarily perceive it that way, and they thought that there was more room for negotiation, that there was more patience on the U.S. side than there really was. But what I think that illustrates is what's really important to how we move forward with China. And what I learned as a negotiator is something that I didn't know 3 years ago. And I think, like a lot of policymakers in the United States, I had this view of China as being monolithic, as being disciplined, of having this plan of how they were going to push back on the United States and dominate our industries with Made in China 2025. And, the reality is much different than that. And I can recall times, I remember when I was in Beijing, it was in February of, I got to think of the year now, as Wendy said, it all blends together, February 2019. And we were in Beijing talking about some of the trade secrets text and what role the courts would play and wouldn't play. And there were folks there from the judiciary in China, and then there were folks from MOFCOM, and they literally started arguing with each other at the table in front of the U.S. team about what concessions they were and weren't going to make. And it just shocked me and blew me away. And I think what your book does, and what I really think is needed in Washington, is a greater appreciation of the differences within China. And we need, in order to move forward with China and achieve some of our goals with China, we need to understand those differences. And then, in my opinion, try to take advantage of them to achieve our different ends. But I think the Washington view of China is very monolithic right now. And I think your book does a great service to that. I could go on for a while here. Let me just comment on a couple of things that were just said that I think I wanted to mention. The first on the business community, I do think we did try to pay more attention to the business community's objectives than maybe is understood. And maybe I say that because I'm one of the folks in the administration who always reached out to the business community to try to understand exactly what they were thinking and incorporate that into there. But it starts from the very beginning in terms of the way the tariffs were designed was intended to spare our business community and place the impact more directly on China's. And the way that the provisions that we asked for, the things we asked for, were all derived from USTR's year after year engagement with stakeholders, whether it's through the NTE or through other processes with China. And so we knew very clearly exactly what the business community wanted. And so I do think that critique is maybe a little bit off base in terms of the deal. But let me just stop there for a second, and Wendy, and maybe you can direct me, because again, I could. Sure. There's a lot I'd love to say on this.
Yeah. So let me follow up with something else that I thought you were going to touch upon, but you didn't, and that is, I think you would agree that there was a lot of misperception on both sides of each side's leverage or wants or who wanted the deal more. What also hit me by this negotiation was there wasn't as much contact at all levels throughout the negotiation and communication between the teams. And I think sometimes that communication can help forestall some of this misreading before it goes to the most senior levels. Do you think that may have played, first of all, do you agree with that assessment? And do you think that could have played a role here?
So it was different at different points in the negotiation. And I would say that we were meeting fairly regularly, either on the sort of the working level, which was for us, it's either our deputy assistant secretary or our assistant secretary level, as well as the deputy level. We had regular calls. I mean, almost throughout this whole process. So that was happening pretty regularly. Where I think there was a challenge is that on both sides, we didn't always have as much direction on precisely what we were trying to achieve. And especially in the beginning, we weren't trying to achieve the same things. And Bob quotes me in the book, and Lingling quotes me in the book, talking about the inflection point when the presidents got on a phone call right before the G20. And I think it's important to realize that before that phone call, we were basically just talking past each other. And we would get in a room and we would tell China, these are our real concerns. And they would say, oh, that's great. Here are our concerns about the US. And it wasn't productive. Then at one point they said, we can do some of what you're asking, but we're not going to tell you exactly what it is. And I mean, that went on for 6 months. And it wasn't until the G20 in Argentina and in the lead up to the G20 in Argentina that we really started to engage on the structural components that were necessary for a deal. Wendy, one thing I did want to touch on too is you wanted to ask me about Wall Street Trump versus blue collar Trump, which I think is a wonderful way of describing it in the book. And I want to touch on that for a second, if I may, because I think there's a couple different ways to look at this that are important. And I think the president is often misunderstood. I mean, first of all, this is just his negotiating style. He likes to keep people off balance. He wanted to keep the Chinese off balance. And I'll admit, sometimes he keeps his staff off balance by in one meeting sort of saying, oh, I'm going to go this direction. And then the next meeting saying this, because he wants us to then argue with each other and try to, and then he can weigh what the optimal outcome actually is. And so a lot of that is intentional. The second point on it is that I actually think the president, much more than many of his most hawkish advisors, understands the importance of giving President Xi political wiggle room. And he appreciates the fact that President Xi has a constituency he has to deal with. And if he pushes him too hard and puts him in a corner too much, it's not going to let him make a deal. And it may also lead to things that get worse than a Cold War. And so I think the president always understood that. And that's why he would say, I don't blame President Xi, I blame our leaders. And that's why he would say, I really have a great relationship, but you guys are really taking advantage of us. And that was calculated. And I don't think he gets enough credit for that. People always say, oh, he's schizophrenic. And really, I actually thought it was calculated because he needed to give them political space. The third point on this, and maybe the more controversial, but maybe what we can learn the most from as we think about how to move forward, is that I think that this actually reflects a divide in U.S. policy at the moment. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure the president has fully decided where he is on this. And this is this competition between, do we think we continue to engage with China to change them, or do we just give up and decouple? Mm-hmm. And I remember early in the negotiation sitting in a room with David Malpass really put this question squarely before us on the deputy level. And they said, what is our goal here? And we all said, we want to figure out how to engage with China, to open it up, to do more business with them. And that was what we tried to do with this deal. even though a lot of U.S. policymaking is moving in a different direction at this moment. And again, I think that is an undecided element of U.S. policy at the moment. And I think that is reflected in what the president says. And it's also reflecting the fact that this deal in some ways is different than everything else our government is doing right now. This is how we are preventing decoupling, whereas a lot of the other stuff we are doing is decoupling. And that's why, regardless of whether this deal solved all of our problems, that's why it's so important to me that it holds. Because if we want to retain that relationship, we need to hold on to things like this where we come together, as opposed to simply focusing on decoupling all the time.
So let me turn now to Bob and Lingling, because I think, Clete, you touched on an excellent point. And I have a quote from the book where you say, Trump was both a China hawk and a China dove. Different aides played to different parts of his China schizophrenia. Not only was the Trump administration tangling with China, it was tangling with itself. How did this play out in the negotiations, Bob?
Well, I think, let me pick up on that and also on something that Clete said, which really resonated. So I think there are people in that administration, the Trump administration, that believe that China, the rise of China, is the most significant threat, I should say, most significant threat to the U.S. since the rise of fascism. People like Peter Navarro, Matt Pottinger, Lighthizer to some degree, but Trump isn't one of those. That's not what he thinks. And then there are people in that administration, where Clete would be closer to this, I think, who think, yes, China's definitely a problem. There are things that we haven't resolved and we should have, but you know, we have to worry about the global economy. There are lots of other issues out there, and Trump isn't one of those either. And he sort of ping-ponged back and forth. And so, as one example, for instance, after we were talking about the so-called reneging, the April blow-up, so Trump is very angry, and John Bolton uses that anger against China at that particular moment to get him to sign on to a big offensive against Huawei Technologies, the big Chinese technology company. And Bolton's really smart. He knew how to, work the levers of government. But Bolton is one of those people who would look at China as Nazi Germany in the Nazi Germany in the making. And so he wound up playing to that part of how the president looked at things.
So, Lingling, do you want to weigh in on anything that Clete said?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, it was very, very insightful review of what transpires throughout the negotiations by Clete. I learned a lot from just a few minutes of his remarks. For sure, I especially wanted to comment on the last point Clete made about really what is the goal for U.S. policymakers, when it comes to China. What kind of, what's really the thing you want to accomplish, and what route do you want to go down going forward? I mean, for the Chinese, that really also the biggest question they're having now about the U.S. intentions. It's like that was really reflected in one of the meetings President Xi had with President Trump in Osaka of last year. So it was very different meeting than the Argentina meeting back in the end of 2018. Back in 2018, I think Xi Jinping really just took charge, right? I'm sure Clete was in the room. He kind of took charge and went through all the things China would do, talked for like 40 minutes or so. But the last meeting, he started by saying, before we talk about trade, let's talk about what kind of relationship we want. If the U.S. intention really is decoupling and not engaging with China in any form and fashion, then what's the point of having a phase one or phase two? There's no point. If we still see areas where we can cooperate with each other and areas we compete with each other, then that calls for continued engagement. Like when I when I was in China, I reached out to some big US businesses there, and I was asking, are you guys leaving China? What's the plan here? And the majority of them would tell you, no, we want to stay in China. We want to continue to be able to sell to Chinese consumers. A couple of them actually are expanding. So in that kind of context, as Bob mentioned earlier, decoupling is not really realistic. Maybe the two countries are moving further away from each other in a lot of areas, but just really talking about decoupling, how realistic that is, it's really a big question. So right now, I think there is an intense debate going on in Zhongnanhai right now about exactly how we should look at the U.S.-China relationship going forward too. As Clete mentioned, the phase one trade deal, so important. It's one of the few things that actually are holding these two countries together now. Isn't that ironic? We started the whole tension, right? Broke out in the trade arena, and now this is the only area where two sides are still talking to each other. So there's a lot of soul searching and evaluating in Zhongnanhai as well, what exactly the U.S. wants to do about China and how we should respond. And President Xi Jinping has said many times, there are 1,000 reasons to have a good relationship with the U.S., not a single one to spoil it. I hope he still believes that.
If I can comment, Wendy, on one of the things Bob said that I thought was interesting, and he talked about the two camps, and those who see China as an existential threat and those who don't. And I actually would probably put it a slightly different way. And I think we all actually see China as that level of threat. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to work for this president, was because I felt like we hadn't done enough to push back on China, and that they were really threatening the whole international trading system. Where there really is the difference of opinion is, what do you do about it and how do you engage? And in the book, Bob and Lingling talk about the debates we had over steel. And, I'm characterized as a globalist free trader, I think, at the end of the book, as someone who, wanted to use the threat of steel tariffs to get other trading partners and allies to do the right thing on steel. And again, that is where we were. But again, it was a difference of opinion. In that case, we all thought Chinese excess capacity was the real problem, but our solution, at least, was more targeted. And with respect to China itself, we all see them as an existential threat, but our way of dealing with it is not to completely decouple, but rather to try to engage to change. And another area where this debate is happening right now is on export controls, quite frankly. And I have, I'm not going to sugarcoat what I think are the serious threats from Huawei, but an argument that I have made in policy debates, and I will continue to make, is that if you really think that China's acquisition of data or the security of devices and 5G networks is an issue, you are better off, keeping them dependent on U.S. critical technologies so that you can put security patches into these systems so that you can continue to get revenue to remain ahead of them, and so you can keep them behind in the development curve. And so my answer is, I'm worried about Huawei, but I think by engaging with them is actually a more successful national security strategy than completely disengaging. Mm-hmm. And again, it's a nuanced point. It gets hard to make in this kind of environment. But my answer is, if you're scared about Huawei taking data off of people's phones, let's have U.S. operating systems on those phones so we can protect it. And so it's, again, I don't want to belabor the point, but I think there is a uniform view in the U.S. that we need to deal with China, and the real debate is just how to do it and how do you utilize relationships and how do you utilize engagement to achieve those goals.
Good. I have a question from a viewer. I think Clete's already kind of touched on it. Let me turn to Bob and Lingling on that, and that is, what is the fate of this phase one deal? Do you think it's going to remain intact, at least until November? The president already has a few times has toyed with the idea publicly, well, maybe I'll withdraw from it. And I would ask Lingling, are there circumstances under which China would withdraw from it? Or, do both of you think that this is kind of the bright spot right now in the relationship and that both sides are working hard towards implementation? I mean, from my point of view, reading Ambassador Lighthizer statements along with Secretary Perdue and Secretary Mnuchin, they're pretty positive about Chinese steps to implement the deal, particularly on the rules side. Obviously, the purchases issue was always a question if they could ever achieve those numbers. And now with COVID, it seems increasingly unrealistic. But come November, is this agreement still going to be in place?
From the U.S. perspective, I think, yes. I mean, there's rumors all the time that the U.S. is going to pull out, and Trump has said that sort of thing also. But, this is a political plus for the president, right? He's got a deal. He can say, only I was the one able to get a deal like this. If you vote for me again, I can get more out of the Chinese. They'll take advantage of, my opponent. So, again, it's a political plus for him. The purchases, I can't imagine they will actually hit the targets, but I think they'll be increasing. And by the time the final numbers come in, the election will be over in any event. I don't see any reason other than the Chinese overplaying their hand, which they have done a number of times, but overplaying their hand and not coming through remotely on the purchase side, where the president would feel they're playing for a sucker, basically, and that might cause them to pull out. But absent that, I think it's all talk, and I think, again, it's a political plus.
Lingling?
Sure. I think China will try very hard not to be seen as an irresponsible player in here. They will try everything they can do, like even if for some reason the deal doesn't stick, and I think it would not be because China totally just took the initiative and unilaterally tell apart the deal. I don't think that would be the case. I think they're trying very hard to hold up its end of the bargain. I think the latest number shows that for the first 5 months of this year, the Chinese imports of U.S. products is like $46 billion or something. It's still very significantly below the targets set by the purchase agreement, but you can see that they have been ramping up purchases, especially for pork, soybeans, and etc. Since April. So they really, as we discussed earlier with Bob and Clete, that's one of the few things that is still holding those two countries together. And one thing that could be really a wild card is whether or not the Chinese would mingle the whole issue with national security with economic and trade negotiations. So far, I think they have really tried hard to separate the two. The whole phase one basically was coming together late last year when the political unrest in Hong Kong really threatened to derail the whole talks. Especially after the U.S. Congress passed the Hong Kong bill, and which was later signed into law by President Trump himself. But even in that kind of circumstances, the Chinese really try hard to keep those two things separate. It just shows the kind of importance they're attaching to this phase one deal, however limited it is.
And Wendy, I want to give a qualified yes to this as well. And what I would say is I really think in many ways it's in China's hands. And I think staying in the deal while China is faithfully implementing it is a political winner for the president, because no one can question his toughness on China. I mean, I think, his track record is different than any president ever. And his leadership on that, I think, is hard to question. But what could happen is that if China starts not meeting the structural requirements that are so important to Lighthizer, or if China very blatantly doesn't hit the agricultural targets or doesn't or stops, cancels purchases that's important to the president and Sonny Perdue, that to me could lead to a scenario where his hand is forced given the broader China climate. The president may have some advisors that tell him, don't be vulnerable on this deal. It makes you look weak. But I don't buy that argument. I think the deal's a political winner because he gets to say, not only have I been tougher than China, but I also cut a deal with them that no one else has ever gotten before.
I mean, we'd also seen, with COVID and with the, associated global economic recession, even if the numbers weren't hit, there still is a good story to tell if indeed China was continuing on the trajectory of significantly increasing purchases. Okay, just the final question, and I think I know the answers from two of the three people. And this is from a viewer. Phase 2, are we ever going to see a phase 2? Are we going to see a phase 2 negotiations start before November? We all know some of the most difficult issues were put off to be addressed in another stage of these trade negotiations. But can the traffic bear a phase 2 negotiation now? Are there any discussions about launching the next phase? Who wants? Clete, you're on.
Sure. Not in the short term, unfortunately. And I don't want to get into everything. I shouldn't get into everything that happened in April or May. But I do think it was a big disappointment to me that we weren't able to get back to that text. I think that we were making some progress on some of those structural issues at that point. But I just, given the political climate and what has happened since then, I just don't see that in the short term. Over the longer term, what I will say, which will sound very un-Trump administration, but I think it's the right answer, is that we need to figure out how to get these discussions about these broader Chinese subsidies and things like that, censorship, cyber, into a multilateral context. I think there's a limit to what we can achieve one-on-one because China at some level sees it as the US trying to keep them down. Whereas if we are able to portray them as an international outlier, which I believe they are, with the support of our allies and partners, then I think we actually have a chance of getting them to change those things.
Bob, phase 2?
I agree with him, but there's one point that Clete made that I just wanted to get back to. He was talking about the perception of China in Washington. So when I went to China in 2011, right? I was not a China expert remotely. I had covered international economics and knew a little about China from negotiations. But my takeaway is China is much more formidable looking from a distance. When you get there, you see it's as screwed up as Washington, and there are, rivalries just like there are in DC. Different personalities, different agencies. What makes China different is the role of the Communist Party. There's nothing like that in Washington. But much of it is, as I say, much less formidable looking when you're actually there and you see all the weaknesses, just like all Americans know the weaknesses in this country. There are, comparable, if not worse, or not deeper, fissures and problems in that society as well.
Lingling, any views on phase 2? Any concluding thoughts?
Sure. I think I agree with Clete. I think it's very unlikely to proceed in the near term. From the Chinese perspective, I think a lot of the issues that would be addressed in phase 2 negotiations also set a very high bar for the Chinese in terms of reforms. In some areas, especially subsidies and SOE related reforms, that probably wouldn't be in line with the core interests of the party. So whatever whether or not phase 2 happens, or what kind of results that could come out of phase 2, not only depends on what kind of techniques the US side decides to adopt, also just as equally depends on the resolve on the Chinese part to really carry out reforms that, yes, might not be good for the party per se, but good for the Chinese economy in the long run.
Okay, well, with that, let's conclude the event. Thank you, Lingling, Bob, and Clete. We've had a great conversation.
Thank you.
I urge everyone who's viewing to pick up the book. It's good reading for a lockdown. It's good reading for the beach. It's good summer reading. I found it to be a page turner, but I also think it's for people who don't know a lot about trade, frankly, because this relationship is just so important. Romance Gone Bad, Superpower Showdown. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.